Section 5 of Youth by Leo Tolstoy, translated by C.J. Hogarth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 5, Chapters 17 through 20. Chapter 17. I get ready to pay some calls. On awaking next morning, my first thoughts were of the affair with Kolpikoff. Once again I muttered to myself and stamped about the room, but there was no help for it. To-day was the last day that I was to spend in Moscow, and it was to be spent, by Papa's orders, in my paying a round of calls which he had written out for me on a piece of paper, his first solicitude on our account being not so much for our morals or our education as for our due observance of the convenances. On the piece of paper was written in his swift, broken handwriting, 1. Prince Ivan Ivanovitch, without fail. 2. The Iowans, without fail. 3. Prince Michael. 4. The Princess Nechludoff and Madame Valakhin, if you wish. Of course I was also to call upon my guardian, upon the rector, and upon the professors. These last-mentioned calls, however, Dimitri advised me not to pay, saying that it was not only unnecessary to do so, but not the thing. However, there were the other visits to be got through. It was the first two on the list, those marked as to be paid without fail, that most alarmed me. Prince Ivan Ivanovitch was a commander-in-chief, as well as old, wealthy, and a bachelor. Consequently, I foresaw that vis-a-vis conversation between him and myself a 16-year-old student, was not likely to be interesting. As for the Iowans, they too were rich, the father being a departmental official of high rank who had only on one occasion called at our house during my grandmother's time. Since her death, I had remarked that the younger Iwan had fought shy of us, and seemed to give himself airs. The elder of the pair, I had heard, had now finished his course in jurisprudence, and gone to hold a post in St. Petersburg, while his brother Sergius, the former object of my worship, was also in St. Petersburg, as a great fat cadet in the corps of pages. When I was a young man, not only did I dislike intercourse with people who thought themselves above me, but such intercourse was, for me, an unbearable torture, owing partly to my constant dread of being snubbed, and partly to my straining every faculty of my intellect to prove to such people my independence. Yet, even if I failed to fulfil the latter part of my father's instructions, I felt that I must carry out the former. I paced my room, and eyed my clothes ready disposed on chairs, the tunic, the sword, and the cap. Just as I was about to set forth, old Grap called to congratulate me, bringing with him Ilinka. Grap père was a Russianized German, and an intolerably effusive, sycophantic old man who was more often than not tipsy. As a rule, he visited us only when he wanted to ask for something, and although Papa sometimes entertained him in his study, old Grap never came to dinner with us. With his subserviency and begging propensities went such a faculty of good humour and a power of making himself at home that every one looked upon his attachment to us as a great honour. For my part, however, I never liked him, and felt ashamed when he was speaking. I was much put out by the arrival of these visitors, and made no effort to conceal the fact. Upon Ilinka I had been so used to look down, and he so used to recognize my right to do so, that it displeased me to think that he was now as much a matriculated student as myself. In some way he appeared to me to have made a point of attaining that equality. I greeted the pair coldly, and without offering them any refreshment, since it went against the grain to do so, and I thought they could ask for anything if they wanted it without my first inviting them to state their requirements. Gave orders for the drozhki to be got ready. Ilinka was a good-natured, extremely moral, and far from stupid young fellow, yet for all that, what people call a person of moods. That is to say, for no apparent reason he was for ever in some pronounced frame of mind, now lachrymose, now frivolous, now touchy on the very smallest point. At the present moment he appeared to be in the last-named mood. He kept looking from his father to myself without speaking, except when directly addressed, at which times he smiled the self-deprecatory, forced smile under which he was accustomed to conceal his feelings, and more especially that feeling of shame for his father which he must have experienced in our house. "So, Nicholas Petrovitch," the old man said to me, following me everywhere about the room as I went through the operation of dressing, while all the while his fat fingers kept turning over and over a silver snuff-box with which my grandmother had once presented me, "as soon as ever I heard from my son that you had passed your examinations so well, though of course your abilities are well known to every one, I at once came to congratulate you, my dear boy. Why, I have carried you on my shoulders before now, and God knows that I love you as though you were my own son. My Ilinka, too, has always been fond of you, and feels quite at home with you." Meanwhile the said Ilinka remained sitting silently by the window, apparently absorbed in contemplation of my three-cornered cap, and every now and then angrily muttering something in an undertone. "Now I also wanted to ask you, Nicholas Petrovitch," his father went on, "whether my son did well in the examinations. He tells me that he is going to be in the same faculty as yourself, and that therefore you will be able to keep an eye on him, and advise him, and so on." "Oh, yes, I suppose he passed well," I replied with a glance at Ilinka, who, conscious of my gaze, reddened violently and ceased to move his lips about. "And might he spend the day with you?" was the father's next request, which he made with a deprecatory smile, as though he stood in actual awe of me, yet always keeping so close to me, wherever I moved, that the fumes of the drink and tobacco in which he had been indulging were constantly perceptible to my nostrils. I felt greatly vexed at his placing me in such a false position towards his son, as well as at his distracting my attention from what was, to me, a highly important operation, namely, the operation of dressing; while, over and above all, I was annoyed by the smell of liquor with which he followed me about. Accordingly, I said very coldly that I could not have the pleasure of Ilinka's company that day, since I should be out. "Ah, I suppose you are going to see your sister?" put in Ilinka with a smile, but without looking at me. "Well, I too have business to attend to." At this I felt even more put out, as well as pricked with compunction, so, to soften my refusal a little, I hastened to say that the reason why I should not be at home that day was that I had to call upon the Prince Ivan Ivanovitch, the Princess Kornakoff, and the Monsieur Iwin, who held such an influential post, as well as probably to dine with the Princess Nechludoff, for I thought that, on learning what important folk I was in the habit of mixing with, the Grafs would no longer think it worth while to pretend to me. However, just as they were leaving, I invited Ilinka to come and see me another day, but he only murmured something unintelligible, and it was plain that he meant never to set foot in the house again. When they had departed, I set off on my round of calls. Woloda, whom I had asked that morning to come with me in order that I might not feel quite so shy as when altogether alone, had declined on the ground that for two brothers to be seen driving in one drozhki would appear so horribly proper. Chapter 18. The Valakhin Family. Accordingly I set off alone. My first call on the route lay at the Valakhin mansion. It was now 3 years since I had seen Sonetchka, and my love for her had long become a thing of the past. Yet there still lingered in my heart a sort of clear, touching recollection of our bygone, childish affection. At intervals also, during those 3 years, I had found myself recalling her memory with such force and vividness that I had actually shed tears, and imagined myself to be in love with her again. But those occasions had not lasted more than a few minutes at a time, and had been long in recurring. I knew that Sonetchka and her mother had been abroad, that, in fact, they had been so for the last 2 years. Also I had heard that they had been in a carriage accident, and that Sonetchka's face had been so badly cut with the broken glass that her beauty was marred. As I drove to their house, I kept recalling the old Sonetchka to my mind, and wondering what she would look like when I met her. Somehow I imagined that, after her 2 years' sojourn abroad, she would look very tall, with a beautiful waist, and, though sedate and imposing, extremely attractive. Somehow, also, my imagination refused to picture her with her face disfigured with scars, but, on the contrary, since I had read somewhere of a lover who remained true to his adored one in spite of her disfigurement with smallpox, strove to imagine that I was in love with Sonetchka, for the purpose of priding myself on holding to my troth in spite of her scars. Yet, as a matter of fact, I was not really in love with her during that drive, but, having once stirred up in myself old memories of love, felt prepared to fall into that condition, and the more so because of late my conscience had often been pricking me for having discarded so many of my old flames. The Valakhins lived in a neat little wooden mansion approached by a courtyard. I gained admittance by ringing a bell (then a rarity in Moscow), and was received by a mincing, smartly attired page. He either could not, or made no attempt to, inform me whether there was any one at home, but, leaving me alone in the dark hall, ran off down a still darker corridor. For a long time I waited in solitude in this gloomy place, out of which, in addition to the front door and the corridor, there only opened a door which, at the moment, was closed. Rather surprised at the dismal appearance of the house, I came to the conclusion that the reason was that its inmates were still abroad. After 5 minutes, however, the door leading into the salon was opened by the page-boy, who then conducted me into a neat, but not richly furnished, drawing-room, where presently I was joined by Sonetchka. She was now 17 years old, and very small and thin, as well as of an unhealthy pallor of face. No scars at all were visible, however, and the beautiful, prominent eyes and bright, cheerful smile were the same as I had known and loved in my childhood. I had not expected her to look at all like this, and therefore could not at once lavish upon her the sentiment which I had been preparing on the way. She gave me her hand in the English fashion, which was then as much a novelty as a door-bell, and, bestowing upon mine a frank squeeze, sat down on the sofa by my side. "Ah, how glad I am to see you, my dear Nicholas!" she said as she looked me in the face with an expression of pleasure so sincere that in the words "my dear Nicholas" I caught the purely friendly rather than the patronizing note. To my surprise she seemed to me simpler, kinder, and more sisterly after her foreign tour than she had been before it. True, I could now see that she had 2 small scars between her nose and temples, but her wonderful eyes and smile fitted in exactly with my recollections, and shone as of old. "But how greatly you have changed!" she went on. "You are quite grown up now, and well, what do you think of me?" "I should never have known you," I replied, despite the fact that at that moment I was thinking that I should have known her anywhere and always. "Why? Am I grown so ugly?" she inquired with a movement of her head. "Oh, no, decidedly not," I hastened to reply. "But you have grown taller and older. As for being uglier, why, you are even—" "Yes, never mind. Do you remember our dances and games, and St. Jerome and Madame Dorat?" As a matter of fact, I could not recollect any Madame Dorat, but saw that Sonetchka was being led away by the joy of her childish recollections, and mixing them up a little. "Ah, what a lovely time it was!" she went on, and once more there shone before me the same eyes and smile as I had always carried in my memory. While she had been speaking, I had been thinking over my position at the present moment, and had come to the conclusion that I was in love with her. The instant, however, that I arrived at that result, my careless, happy mood vanished. A mist seemed to arise before me which concealed even her eyes and smile, and, blushing hotly, I became tongue-tied and ill at ease. "But times are different now," she went on with a sigh and a little lifting of her eyebrows. "Everything seems worse than it used to be, and ourselves too. Is it not so, Nicholas?" I could return her no answer, but sat silently looking at her. "Where are those Iowans and Kornakoffs now? Do you remember them?" she continued, looking, I think, with some curiosity at my blushing, downcast countenance. "What splendid times we used to have!" Still I could not answer her. The next moment I was relieved from this awkward position by the entry of old Madame Valakhin into the room. Rising, I bowed, and straightway recovered my faculty of speech. On the other hand, an extraordinary change now took place in Sonetchka. All her gaiety and bonhomie disappeared. Her smile became quite a different one, and, except for the point of her shortness of stature, she became just the lady from abroad whom I expected to find in her. Yet for this change there was no apparent reason, since her mother smiled every whit as pleasantly, and expressed in her every movement just the same benignity as of old. Seating herself in her armchair, the old lady signed to me to come and sit beside her, after which she said something to her daughter in English, and Sonetchka left the room, a fact which still further helped to relieve me. Madame then inquired after my father and brother, and passed on to speak of her great bereavement, the loss of her husband. Presently, however, she seemed to become sensible of the fact that I was not helping much in the conversation, for she gave me a look as much as to say, "If now, my dear boy, you were to get up, to take your leave and to depart, it would be well. But a curious circumstance had overtaken me. While she had been speaking of her bereavement, I had recalled to myself not only the fact that I was in love, but the probability that the mother knew of it, whereupon such a fit of bashfulness had come upon me that I felt powerless to put any member of my body to its legitimate use. I knew that if I were to rise and walk I should have to think where to plant each foot, what to do with my head, what with my hands, and so on. In a word, I foresaw that I should be very much as I had been on the night when I partook too freely of champagne, and therefore, since I felt uncertain of being able to manage myself if I did rise, I ended by feeling unable to rise. Meanwhile, I should say, Sonetchka had returned to the room with her work, and seated herself in a far corner, a corner whence, as I was nevertheless sensible, she could observe me. Madame must have felt some surprise as she gazed at my crimson face and noted my complete immobility, but I decided that it was better to continue sitting in that absurd position than to risk something unpleasant by getting up and walking. Thus I sat on and on, in the hope that some unforeseen chance would deliver me from my predicament. That unforeseen chance at length presented itself in the person of an unforeseen young man, who entered the room with an air of being one of the household, and bowed to me politely as he did so. Whereupon Madame rose, excused herself to me for having to speak with her homme d'affaires, and finally gave me a glance which said, "Well, if you do mean to go on sitting there for ever, at least I can't drive you away." Accordingly, with a great effort, I also rose, but finding it impossible to do any leave-taking, moved away towards the door, followed by the pitying glances of mother and daughter. All at once I stumbled over a chair, although it was lying quite out of my route, the reason for my stumbling being that my whole attention was so centred upon not tripping over the carpet. Driving through the fresh air, however, where I first muttered and fidgeted about so much that Kuzma, my coachman, asked me what was the matter, I soon found this feeling pass away, and began to meditate quietly concerning my love for Sonetchka and her relations with her mother, which had appeared to me rather strange. When, afterwards, I told my father that mother and daughter had not seemed on the best of terms with one another, he said, "Yes, Madame leads the poor girl an awful life with her meanness. Yet," added my father with a greater display of feeling than a man might naturally conceive for a mere relative, "she used to be such an original, dear, charming woman. I cannot think what has made her change so much. By the way, you didn't notice a secretary fellow about, did you? Fancy a Russian lady having an affair with a secretary!" "Yes, I saw him," I replied. "And was he at least good-looking?" "No, not at all." "It is extraordinary," concluded Papa, with a cough and an irritable hoist of his shoulder. "Well, I am in love," was my secret thought to myself as I drove along in my drozhki. Chapter 19. The Kornakoffs. My second call on the route lay at the Kornakoffs, who lived on the first floor of a large mansion facing the Arbat. The staircase of the building looked extremely neat and orderly, yet in no way luxurious, being lined only with drugget pinned down with highly polished brass rods. Nowhere were there any flowers or mirrors to be seen. The salon, too, with its polished floor, which I traversed on my way to the drawing-room, was decorated in the same cold, severe, unostentatious style. Everything in it looked bright and solid, but not new, and pictures, flower-stands, and articles of bric-a-brac were wholly absent. In the drawing-room I found some of the young princesses seated, but seated with a sort of correct company air about them which gave one the impression that they sat like that only when guests were expected. "Mamma will be here presently," the eldest of them said to me as she seated herself by my side. For the next quarter of an hour this young lady entertained me with such an easy flow of small talk that the conversation never flagged a moment. Yet somehow she made so patent the fact that she was just entertaining me that I felt not altogether pleased. Amongst other things, she told me that their brother Stephen, whom they called Etienne, and who had been 2 years at the College of Cadets, had now received his commission. Whenever she spoke of him, and more particularly when she told me that he had flouted his mother's wishes by entering the Hussars, she assumed a nervous air, and immediately her sisters, sitting there in silence, also assumed a nervous air. When, again, she spoke of my grandmother's death, she assumed a mournful air, and immediately the others all did the same. Finally, when she recalled how I had once struck St. Jerome and been expelled from the room, she laughed and showed her bad teeth, and immediately all the other princesses laughed and showed their bad teeth too. Next the Princess Mother herself entered, a little dried-up woman with a wandering glance and a habit of always looking at somebody else when she was addressing one. Taking my hand, she raised her own to my lips for me to kiss it, which otherwise, not supposing it to be necessary, I should not have done. "How pleased I am to see you," she said with her usual clearness of articulation as she gazed at her daughters. "And how like your mother you look! Does he not, Lise?" Lise assented, though I knew for a fact that I did not resemble my mother in the least. "And what a grown-up you have become! My Etienne, you will remember, is your second cousin. No, not second cousin. What is it, Lise?" "My mother was Barbara Dimitrievna, daughter of Dimitri Nicolovitch, and your grandmother was Natalia Nicolaevna." "Then he is our third cousin, Mamma," said the eldest girl. "Oh, how you always confuse me!" was her mother's angry reply. "Not third cousin, but cousin german. That is your relationship to Etienne. He is an officer now. Did you know it? It is not well that he should have his own way too much. You young men need keeping in hand, or— Well, you are not vexed because your old aunt tells you the plain truth? I always kept Etienne strictly in hand, for I found it necessary to do so. Yes, that is how our relationship stands," she went on. "Prince Ivan Ivanovitch is my uncle, and your late mother's uncle also. Consequently, I must have been your mother's first cousin. No, second cousin. Yes, that is it. Tell me, have you been to call on Prince Ivan yet?" I said no, but that I was just going to. "Ah, is it possible?" she cried. "Why, you ought to have paid him the first call of all. Surely you know that he stands to you in the position of a father? He has no children of his own, and his only heirs are yourself and my children. You ought to pay him all possible deference, both because of his age, and because of his position in the world, and because of everything else. I know that you young fellows of the present day think nothing of relationships and are not fond of old men. Yet do you listen to me, your old aunt, for I am fond of you, and was fond of your mother, and had a very great liking and respect for your grandmother. You must not fail to call upon him on any account." I said that I would certainly go, and since my present call seemed to me to have lasted long enough, I rose, and was about to depart, but she restrained me. "No, wait a minute," she cried. "Where is your father, Lise? Go and tell him to come here. He will be so glad to see you," she added, turning to me. 2 minutes later Prince Michael entered. He was a short, thick-set gentleman, very slovenly dressed and ill-shaven, yet wearing such an air of indifference that he looked almost a fool. He was not in the least glad to see me. At all events, he did not intimate that he was. But the Princess, who appeared to stand in considerable awe of him, hastened to say— "Is not Woldemar here?" She seemed to have forgotten my name. "Exactly like his mother?" And she gave her husband a glance which forced him to guess what she wanted. Accordingly he approached me with his usual passionless, half-discontented expression, and held out to me an unshaven cheek to kiss. "Why, you are not dressed yet, though you have to go out soon," was the Princess's next remark to him in the angry tone which she habitually employed in conversation with her domestics. "It will only mean your offending some one again, and trying to set people against you." In a moment, mother," said Prince Michael, and departed. I also made my bows, and departed. This was the first time I had heard of our being related to Prince Ivan Ivanovitch, and the news struck me unpleasantly. Chapter 20. The Iowans. As for the prospect of my call upon the Prince, it seemed even more unpleasant. However, the order of my route took me first to the Iowans, who lived in a large and splendid mansion in Tverskaya Street. It was not without some nervousness that I entered the great portico, where a Swiss major domo stood armed with his staff of office. To my inquiry as to whether any one was at home, he replied, "Whom do you wish to see, sir? The General's son is within." "And the General himself?" I asked with forced assurance. "I must report to him your business first. What may it be, sir?" said the major domo as he rang a bell. Immediately the gaitered legs of a footman showed themselves on the staircase above, whereupon I was seized with such a fit of nervousness that I hastily bid the lacquey say nothing about my presence to the General, since I would first see his son. By the time I had reached the top of the long staircase, I seemed to have grown extremely small, metaphorically, I mean, not actually, and had very much the same feeling within me as had possessed my soul when my drozhki drew up to the great portico, namely, a feeling as though drozhki, horse, and coachman had all of them grown extremely small too. I found the General's son lying asleep on a sofa, with an open book before him. His tutor, Monsieur Frost, under whose care he still pursued his studies at home, had entered behind me with a sort of boyish tread, and now awoke his pupil. Iwan evinced no particular pleasure at seeing me, while I also seemed to notice that, while talking to me, he kept looking at my eyebrows. Although he was perfectly polite, I conceived that he was entertaining me much as the Princess Valakhin had done, and that he not only felt no particular liking for me, but even that he considered my acquaintance in no way necessary to one who possessed his own circle of friends. All this arose out of the idea that he was regarding my eyebrows. In short, his bearing towards me appeared to be, as I recognized with an awkward sensation, very much the same as my own towards Ilinka Grap. I began to feel irritated, and to interpret every fleeting glance which he cast at Monsieur Frost as a mute inquiry. "Why has this fellow come to see me?" After some conversation, he remarked that his father and mother were at home. Would I not like to visit them too? "First I will go and dress myself," he added as he departed to another room, notwithstanding that he had seemed to be perfectly well dressed in a new frock-coat and white waistcoat in the present one. A few minutes later he reappeared in his University uniform, buttoned up to the chin, and we went downstairs together. The reception-rooms through which we passed were lofty and of great size, and seemed to be richly furnished with marble and gilt ornaments, chintz-covered settees, and a number of mirrors. Presently Madame Iwin met us, and we went into a little room behind the drawing-room, where, welcoming me in very friendly fashion, she seated herself by my side, and began to inquire after my relations. Closer acquaintance with Madame, whom I had seen only twice before, and that but for a moment on each occasion, impressed me favourably. She was tall, thin, and very pale, and looked as though she suffered from chronic depression and fatigue. Yet, though her smile was a sad one, it was very kind, and her large, mournful eyes, with a slight cast in their vision, added to the pathos and attractiveness of her expression. Her attitude, while not precisely that of a hunchback, made her whole form droop, while her every movement expressed languor. Likewise, though her speech was deliberate, the timbre of her voice, and the manner in which she lisped her r's and l's, were very pleasing to the ear. Finally, she did not entertain me. Unfortunately, the answers which I returned to her questions concerning my relations seemed to afford her a painful interest, and to remind her of happier days, with the result that when presently her son left the room, she gazed at me in silence for a moment, and then burst into tears. As I sat there in mute bewilderment, I could not conceive what I had said to bring this about. At first I felt sorry for her as she sat there weeping with downcast eyes. Next I began to think to myself, ought I not try to comfort her, and how ought that to be done? Finally, I began to feel vexed with her for placing me in such an awkward position. Surely my appearance is not so moving as all that, I reflected. Or is she merely acting like this to see what I shall do under the circumstances? Yet it would not do for me to go, I continued to myself, for that would look too much as though I were fleeing to escape her tears. Accordingly, I began fidgeting about on my seat, in order to remind her of my presence. "Oh, how foolish of me!" at length she said, as she gazed at me for a moment and tried to smile. "There are days when one weeps for no reason whatever." She felt about for her handkerchief, and then burst out weeping more violently than before. "Oh dear! How silly of me to be for ever crying like this! Yet I was so fond of your mother. We were such friends. We were—" At this point she found her handkerchief, and, burying her face in it, went on crying. Once more I found myself in the same protracted dilemma. Though vexed, I felt sorry for her, since her tears appeared to be genuine, even though I also had the idea that it was not so much for my mother that she was weeping as for the fact that she was unhappy, and had known happier days. How it would all have ended I do not know, had not her son reappeared and said that his father desired to see her. Thereupon she rose, and was just about to leave the room, when the General himself entered. He was a small, grizzled, thick-set man, with bushy black eyebrows, a grey, close-cropped head, and a very stern, haughty expression of countenance. I rose and bowed to him, but the General, who was wearing 3 stars on his green frock-coat, not only made no response to my salutation, but scarcely even looked at me, so that all at once I felt as though I were not a human being at all, but only some negligible object such as a settee or a window, or, if I were a human being, as though I were quite indistinguishable from such a negligible object. "Then you have not yet written to the Countess, my dear?" he said to his wife in French, and with an imperturbable, yet determined expression on his countenance. "Good-bye, Monsieur Irtenieff," Madame said to me, in her turn, as she made a proud gesture with her head and looked at my eyebrows, just as her son had done. I bowed to her, and again to her husband, but my second salutation made no more impression upon him than if a window had just been opened or closed. Nevertheless, the younger Iwan accompanied me to the door, and on the way told me that he was to go to St. Petersburg University, since his father had been appointed to a post in that city, and young Iwan named a very high office in the service. "Well, his Papa may do whatever he likes," I muttered to myself as I climbed into the drozhki, "but at all events I will never set foot in that house again. His wife weeps and looks at me as though I were the embodiment of woe, while that old pig of a General does not even give me a bow. However, I will get even with him some day. How I meant to do that I do not know, but my words nevertheless came true." Afterwards, I frequently found it necessary to remember the advice of my father when he said that I must cultivate the acquaintanceship of the Iwans, and not expect a man in the position of General Iwan to pay any attention to a boy like myself. But I had figured in that position long enough. End of Section 5. Recording by Bill Boerst.